I've been pretty shocked in the last couple of years to learn that the military and the government are more and more open about the existence of UFOs. And in doing a research project for the Air Force for a master's degree I was doing for my current rank, I wrote about UFOs and national security. In a previous video, I talked about the background regarding the military and certain projects that they had in place to study UFOs. And in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the theories about what these things could be, what these UFOs could possibly be. Now, what are the facts? To look back at our previous video and kind of distill everything and bring everything in summary here, what are some of the facts that just have to be explained? Well, number one, people are claiming to see UFOs, and this really has been going on not only for decades, but for centuries. If you read Jacques Vallée's and Chris Albeck's Wonders in the Sky and other books by Vallée, we're told that people have been claiming about UFOs and weird things in the skies and what most people would describe as kind of alien abductions for hundreds of years, going back until ancient times. Here in the United States, it became pretty popular, or we see the history really getting off the ground in the 1940s, although there had been airships and other sightings in the late 1890s, and really even prior to that. In fact, there had been pretty interesting and, well, sightings from well-known people from the 1500s here in the United States. And so we have to ask, what's going on? Well, one thing is people are just seeing these UFOs. We have to take account as to, well, if they're seeing these things, we have to kind of understand what's going on. What could they possibly be? Well, another aspect about these UFOs that people are seeing is that they can go unbelievably fast. They can perform 90 and 180 degree turns. They can pop into existence or vanish out of existence seemingly from nothing and to nothing. They leave physical traces sometimes, like radiation. They can have biological effects on people. They can change their shape. They can go from being a square to more of a sphere. They can change colors. They can go through air, space, and water like there's nothing there. They don't normally produce sound, although sometimes they can, but what you would expect in terms of sound, if they break the sound barrier, there should be a sonic boom. There should be a heat signature. We don't really see that oftentimes. So these are some of the facts. Number three, people are seeing and having experiences, including apparent abductions with some kind of beings. Now, I realize that most people categorize these kinds of behaviors, events, or instances with crazy people and lunatics and those kind of things. But there have just been so many people around the world for so long now saying that they're having these abductions. It's making some serious academic people and researchers and just normal people question what in the world is going on. There's got to be something to this. It can't all just be hoaxes and lies. There's got to be something actually going on to account for all of these people saying they're having some kind of encounters with beings. So, for example, back in I believe it was the 50s, we have the famous Betty and Barney Hill incident where they claimed they were taken into a spaceship. We had the famous event in 1975 of Travis Walton saying that he was taken up, and he had six people claim to have seen a UFO and beam him up, basically, suck him up off the ground, and then drop him back on the ground. They hightailed it out, and he claimed to have been abducted. So, number four, these beings come in different sizes, shapes, and appearances. There's all kinds of different descriptions of these kinds of beings. So some of these beings are more like the grays that they're normally called. These are the kind that we normally think of when we think of aliens. Big head, big eyes, smaller body. Normally these things have two arms, two legs, very much like a human being. There's a reptilian race, there's a Nordic race, which are kind of they look like humans. They have blonde hair, they're attractive looking people, or like people. There's just all, I think there's 20 something or more different kinds of alleged beings that people talk about regarding these experiences that they have. So they come in different sizes, shapes, and appearances, both the alien beings and the UFOs. So the UFOs can be triangular. They can be, and this is one thing that's interesting about them, is that they kind of take on what's expected from the culture. So they morph and change the technology based on the culture. So, for example, in China, there's lots of accounts of seeing dragons in the sky. Well, when we get closer to, say, the 1800s, now we start seeing these airships. And then once we start seeing more and more airplanes in the sky, we see discs. And then we see triangles and all sorts of things. So these things come in different sizes and shapes and appearances. And the UFO activity is often associated with paranormal and poltergeist activity. So oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes when people see UFOs, especially when they're talking about the more close encounter type stuff, they often will claim to have other kinds of really weird poltergeistish, occultic type experiences. And ufologists like Jacques Vallée, John Keel, J. Allen Hynek, people who were academic in the field, not just people who were doing this as a hobby or not people who were trying to sensationalize it, but people who are doing bona fide academic research are saying that oftentimes people who have these closer experiences with UFOs, not way off there, there's this close encounter list. There's close encounters of the first kind, second kind, third kind. Now there's a fourth and fifth kind. And the first kind is way off in the distance, and second, there's some kind of physical activity. Third is you're having interaction, or you can see beings. And then as you get higher up in that order of close encounters, you're actually interacting with beings, or there's people called contactees who claim that they have regular contact with whatever these beings are. So this activity has been and oftentimes is associated with really other weird type stuff like poltergeist activity, things that you would think of in like paranormal activity type movies where you got doors opening and drawers opening and shutting. Back when they used to have phones, hardline phones, landline phones, the phone would ring and there wouldn't be anybody on the other side. Or you hear a car door and there's no car. Or you hear a baby crying in the house and there wouldn't be a baby anywhere. Just weird stuff that couldn't be explained. Footsteps, all kinds of weird things would associate with these UFO experiences, especially the closer one got to these alleged UFOs or these beings. So this activity is often associated with other kinds of weird stuff like that. And many cultic groups have come out of the UFO movement with teachings similar to those of the New Age and deny core Christian teachings such as the deity of Jesus. These groups have been around a while. There are even UFO groups or cult groups that claim that Jesus was an alien or aliens raised him up from the dead. And incidentally, this is why it's important if you're going to do apologetics to start with classical apologetics, to first show that God exists and then put all these evidences in the resurrection in the context of general classical theism. So we don't have to resort to these weird responses by people say, well, it was aliens or well, just some weird normal activity. No, if you put all this stuff in a theistic context, it makes a lot more sense and it fits the context of it. And it's also what Jesus is saying regarding his place in the world and his association with what we see in the Old Testament. Now, what are some of the various views? So these are the basic facts. And if you're familiar with the minimal facts of the resurrection, the way that sometimes apologists will argue for that, there are certain facts that any theory has to account for, like, for example, that Jesus died, his disciples claimed they saw him raised from the dead. They were transformed. They went from being scared and skeptical to being bold and being willing to die for their beliefs, to be imprisoned, beaten, all that. Paul and James were converted, and we also have to account for the empty tomb, even though it's not one of the minimal facts, strictly speaking. So all these facts that I just shared with this UFO stuff, any theory has to really take that into account. So what are some of the theories? Well, one of the theories is just that these are natural explanations, that there are things, and most UFO sightings, about 95+% roughly, can be explained naturally speaking. It was a misidentification of a planet. It was a misidentification of an aircraft, weather, something weird with the weather on satellites, something like that. So these are natural explanations that will account for most of the sightings, but there's a small percentage of the sightings that cannot be explained through these normal conventional ways. And what's interesting is that even our government and military is coming out. They're coming out saying that, yeah, we have these reports. They're starting more and more to start these task forces, like UAP, or Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, by the Navy, by the Department of Defense. They're having congressional hearings that haven't happened in like 50 years. And so they're taking this pretty seriously. You probably are familiar with these sightings our Navy pilots had in 2004 and 15. And that came out of the New York Times, and the Pentagon said, yeah, they're really seeing these things. These are legitimate videos. And these are just a few videos. Pilots have been seeing these things for years, and there's a lot of documentation out there about all these sightings. So we have to take into consideration, what are they? Well, apart from the natural explanations, one of the most famous and almost automatic go-to response is, well, it's aliens. All right, beings from another planet. So UFO, the term UFO, is oftentimes associated with just alien spacecraft. Now, it shouldn't be that way, because there are other explanations as to what a UFO could be. But oftentimes, it is just simply the case that people, when they say UFO or they think UFO, they are thinking about an alien spacecraft. Well, that's one theory. It could definitely be, according to those proponents, an alien spacecraft. In fact, one of the Air Force officers, Captain Edward Ruppelt, in the last line of his 1956 account of his book about Project Blue Book, says it might be interstellar. In fact, I'm going to read a line from this book. This is his book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, by Edward Ruppelt, who was one of the leading figures of Project Blue Book. And he wrote a 1956 edition on his experiences about running this project. And in his first edition, he ends with this: maybe the final proven answer will be that all of UFOs that have been reported are merely misidentified known objects. Or maybe the many pilots, radar specialists, generals, industrialists, scientists, and the man on the street who have told me I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't seen it myself, knew what they were talking about. Maybe the Earth is being visited by interplanetary spaceships. Only time will tell. Now, he did go on to write in 1960, in a revised version. He added 3 chapters, and he came out very much against that view that it was interplanetary. But many people hold to this interplanetary view of what these things could possibly be. So are they extraterrestrial? Well, one of the topmost, and probably the foremost ufologist of our day, Jacques Vallée, who's a French researcher. Again, if you saw my previous video on this, if you've seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind by Steven Spielberg, the French scientist in that movie he's patterned after Jacques Vallée. And Jacques Vallée, he used to work with J. Allen Hynek on Project Blue Book, along with Edward Ruppelt. He says the real question is, does the spacecraft hypothesis explain to our satisfaction the facts of the UFO phenomena as we know them today? The answer is a definite and resounding no. He says, or John Keel says, another researcher in paranormal type stuff and UFOs, the soft sightings, that is like having seen discs kind of farther away, being more numerous comprise the real phenomena and deserve the most study. The scope, frequency, and distribution of the sightings make the popular extraterrestrial interplanetary hypothesis completely untenable. So if we're going to argue, so you might ask, well, what are the arguments for the interplanetary view? Well, if people are seeing flying ships, flying spacecraft or craft, then it almost just makes sense to say, well, if they're not from here, they must be from there, somewhere else. But the problem is, well, here we go. Here are some problems with that view. Number one, the frequency, and this is taken mostly from Jacques Vallée's works, the frequency of close encounters. So, for example, there are just many hundreds of thousands, and Vallée thinks maybe even in the millions, numbers of sightings that people have had, even with close encounters. And the question is, why do they need to come? They come here in different spaceships. They come here in different kinds of spaceships. They come in different, they look different species of these beings, supposedly. And they normally do the same kind of thing. They normally abduct people, supposedly, or they will take samples of plants or soil. They will do very primitive, apparently, tests on human subjects, on animals, cattle mutilation, that kind of thing. And the question is, why do they have to do that hundreds, thousands, or maybe even millions of times? What is the point of doing it? Don't they have what they need? So the frequency of these close encounters, according to Vallée, is such that it doesn't make a lot of sense. What about the physiology? The physiology of these beings is very similar, and at least in most of these instances. Now, we'll start looking at the reptilian type. That's different. But normally, we're looking at beings that are very much like you and me in terms of our anatomical structure. A head, even though it's bigger with big eyes and a little slit for a mouth and maybe a couple holes for a nose, still has the same basic 2 arms, 2 legs, abdomen, head. They can see in our color spectrum. They can hear in our spectrum of being able to hear. And this is what Vallée is saying. Now, the chances, and this is what's really interesting for a non-Christian to say, the chances of that happening for other species, and remember, there are multiple kinds of species, supposedly. The chances of that happening on just an unguided process of evolution is pretty much zero. And this is coming from people who hold evolution. They're saying that we're not going to see the same basic anatomical structure where they can see in our color spectrum and hear in our ways of hearing, and have it just look like us, even if there's just the basic structure. That's not going to happen, according to what Vallée says, regarding just if it's just unguided evolution. Now, if it's theistic evolution and God's running it, then those odds would change dramatically. But if one holds to general, unguided, Darwinian type evolution, then those odds are pretty much zero. The number of alleged abductions, this would go with the first point, is that there are so many abductions. Why do they need to keep having tests on people, on plants, on animals? Why do they need to keep doing it? Are they not getting what they need the first few 100,000 times? And also, the way they do things are very, very primitive. In fact, we have seemingly better technology than what these beings would have, and sometimes they're supposed to have, implant babies in women, or take semen samples, sperm samples out of men, and these kind of things to supposedly reproduce or test our reproductive systems and weird stuff like that. And number 4, if you look at the history of ufology and mythology, we see that the abduction phenomena is very similar to local folklore and mythology of the time. So, for example, Valet gives as his example. A lot of it comes out of Ireland and the Celtic folklore. Very similar kind of things between what we see with local myth and folklore and with what we see with alien abductions. And so this is nothing new. It goes back into, it's very tied and similar to many religions of certain lands and peoples. It's all over the world. And Valet does a great job of showing how people who would go missing in the Celtic lands have the same kind of characteristics with those stories as we have with our alleged alien abductions. So if you look at the grand scheme of things, this didn't just start happening. And some people want to say this just started happening around the mid-1940s when we started using nuclear weapons, and these beings are trying to tell us to stop using nuclear weapons. But this has been going on for a long time. And if you look at the big picture, it fits into a general religious mythological kind of scheme. Okay, so that's number 4. Number 5, in terms of the arguments against the extraterrestrial hypothesis, is what Valet terms a new theory, or the interdimensional hypothesis, because he rejects this theory. Now, interestingly, Valet doesn't talk about the problem with interstellar travel, which is a main problem in this discussion. Now, there are astronomers who believe that interstellar travel is possible, and there are other astronomers who believe that it's not possible, that even if there is other life on other planets, which is another question altogether, there would be no way they could get here, because it would take so long. And if they were going to go even a tenth of the speed of light, a fraction of the speed of light, then they would have a lot of trouble with space debris, because space is not empty. And when you run into things in space, we can think of just a speck of dust. Then if you're going the speed of light, or a fraction of the speed of light, then you're going to be destroyed. So interstellar travel is very debatable. And many astronomers, like Hugh Ross, for example, argues that this is not possible. It's interesting that Valet doesn't bring that point up. But he does argue for a different theory, namely the interdimensional hypothesis. Valet's hypothesis is such that he thinks these are physical beings that are not from another planet. They're from our area, our planet, but they are able to go between time and space dimensions. So there are various dimensions, according to Valet, and physicists who tell us there are multiple dimensions. But Valet is saying that they have somehow figured out how to manipulate space and time dimensions. Well, according to astronomers like, for example, Hugh Ross, who was a Caltech astronomer, used to be the CEO and president of Reasons to Believe, now still working with him, but doing more of reaching out, speaking, writing kind of projects, says that even if there were these, and he doesn't believe there are multiple dimensions, but he says, according to Einstein's theories of relativity, once you're in a dimension, you're stuck there. You can't just go between these different dimensions. Now, I'm not an astronomer or a physicist. I'm going to leave that with them to debate that point. But another point, though, that's brought up against this alien view is the fact that they seem to be not, at bottom, they don't seem to be physical in nature. And what surrounds them is a very occultic type of activity. And what's really interesting, and what really interested me in ufology about 3 years ago when I started studying it, is you've got several high-level researchers like Valet, Hynek, and Keel, who are saying that these beings, whatever they are, now Valet thinks they're physical, but Hynek and Keel thought that they were not physical in the sense that we think about. Maybe they have some kind of, they're on a plane of energy, or they're kind of psychological, or have psychic energy in terms of what Hynek thinks. But they all think that they're deceitful and want to control our thoughts. And many, like Keel and Hynek, think that they're not really physical because they can do things that physical beings shouldn't be able to do, whether it's these going super fast and being able to pull a 180-degree turn on a dime, or go through things, or disappear and reappear. Something physical shouldn't be able to do that. And we're going to see more of that when we talk about their view. They're explicitly anti-Christian. These aliens that were supposed to be aliens are explicitly anti-Christian, not just anti-religious, but inherently anti-Christian, especially when it comes to the deity of Jesus Christ. They argue that Jesus was either just a regular human, or Jesus had some kind of superpowers as a human, or they had some kind of new age twist on Jesus, or they even might say Jesus is an alien himself. So what about the interdimensional view? Vallée says, to put it bluntly, the UFO phenomenon does not give evidence of being extraterrestrial at all. Instead, it appears to be interdimensional and to manipulate physical realities outside of our own space-time continuum. Now, what about his theory? This seems to be interesting, although somewhat ad hoc. Ad hoc is literally it means to this. It's a Latin phrase that means to this. And it's when you've got a theory that's put out there without really any evidence. Now, of course, Vallée is going to say he has evidence for his theory, but we have certain facts. But do we have evidence of people being able to go through different space-time dimensions? Someone could argue that this theory that Vallée holds to is seemingly ad hoc. Creative. It also suffers problems according to other astronomers like Hugh Ross, who say you're stuck into a given time-space dimension if you're in one. Is this even possible? It is very conjectural. We don't have any, that I know of, any kind of scientific experiments to show that we can go through different dimensions. And then number 3, this has less consistency and explanatory power and explanatory scope than the spiritual demonic view that we're going to get to in the next video. So there are some strengths here. It does take into account the facts that have to be explained. And hypothetically, it probably would work if you could show that there was the possibility of being able to go through these different dimensions. But is it possible? Is it ad hoc? And is it as consistent with the demonic and spiritual view? According to Ross, per the theory of relativity, again, Vallée's theory is irrelevant since we are locked into a single dimension. Now, we're going to talk about the psychological view and the demonic view in the next video. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope it was interesting to you. And if it was, then make sure you hit the like and subscribe button, and make sure to tune in into the next video when we talk about the spiritual or demonic view regarding what these things might actually be.